RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast, where we build machines.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Rugby Renegade Podcast. My name's Jamie Bain and today I interview Dave Cripps from Coalition Performance and also former strength and conditioning coach at Leicester Tigers. Great interview. Dave, kindly gave up his time to share his insights in working at Leicester and what he's doing now at Coalition Performance. He's been fortunate enough to be at Leicester for a number of years and work all the way through the different age groups, through the academy and into the first team. So he gives a really good insight of different training emphasis at different stages. And we chatted about loads of stuff. Felt like we could have chatted for hours. And then another thing I think he goes into good detail is having a clear rationale based on science of what you're trying to affect as a strength and conditioning coach and what your training is trying to affect as a player or an athlete, and then making sure you're getting the most bang from your buck with the training you choose. So have a listen. I'm sure you're going to learn lots, and let us know what you think afterwards. Hi Dave, welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Thanks for making time in your schedule to come and have a chat with us.
No, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, Dave. You're currently working for Coalition Performance, and I guess what we want to pick your brains about, though, obviously the rugby side of things. You've got a lot of experience of your time working with Leicester Tigers. So why don't you sort of tell us about how you got into strength and conditioning, your time working at Tigers, and then how you kind of moved into Coalition Performance?
Yeah, I suppose I started out like most of us, enjoyed training, enjoyed sport. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I worked hard at it. Scraped into university, did my kind of undergraduate, postgraduate degrees, and I enjoyed the kind of research side of it. But my real passion was was fucking actually getting involved and actually training the stuff, not just researching it. So I spent a lot of time during that period, over a number of years, just getting experience wherever I could, interning, visiting people, networking, and multiple things that happened as a result of that led to me getting involved at Leicester initially with the academy, and it really grew from there, to be honest. So spent several seasons there, from I think it was about 07 or 08 up until the back end of last year. Actually coached S&C wise with all the age groups there, so managed a pre-academy structure that we set up in place, strength and conditioning wise, for all the, as they were called back then, EPDG players. But my main priority ultimately was to look after a group of senior squad players for a number of years and develop them through and get the very best out of them and support them with all the challenges along the way with injuries and everything that comes with playing rugby as well.
Oh, great. And we spoke a little bit before, and obviously Leicester are one of the the great clubs of English rugby. Had some really successful periods, and they're always up there and thereabouts come playoff time. And a lot of that, certainly from people from outside, they look and they see they've got that winning culture. So tell us a bit about that. What's it like, that sort of atmosphere and culture working in?
Yeah, people I suppose have got different perceptions of it and different ways they describe it. I mean, I know Richard Cockrell always used to describe it as a brutal environment, and it stemmed a lot, I suppose, from tradition. Because things had always been done a certain way in terms of expectations on players and whatnot. That kind of naturally transferred through to other players, particularly those who had maybe been through the academy structure, which was really the I suppose the foundation of that. But it did have a huge impact. I think equally as well, there's, when you talk about cultural stuff, there's a lot of misconceptions that people can make as well, in relation to how it actually is in reality. So from an S&C perspective, it was a challenging environment to work in, but the type of challenging environment, I suppose, that enabled you to push yourself and make sure what you were delivering as an S&C coach was the very best, because you had to rationalise everything, and not just rationalise it in deep science. You also had to be able to rationalise it in the way to make it clear with the rugby coaches, players who weren't interested in the science and bits and pieces like that. So we were part of that. You know, our expectations to fit in with that culture, to have that same work ethic were really big. But, you know, at the same time, professional sport by its nature doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's professional to the same degree. There were guys equally as with other rugby clubs in other sports that had different levels of application, and they were the ones naturally from a coaching perspective that you had more challenge with. But as a whole, the culture compared to other clubs, from what I understand, I hadn't been in other clubs, but from speaking to other coaches at other clubs, was different, and in many ways it made our job maybe a little bit easier, but then at the same time with those expectations as well, it also maybe made it a bit more challenging as well.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously that pressure to perform, I guess. So like now you're working at Coalition Performance, private sector. What are the sort of biggest things you've taken from rugby and working in that environment that you're applying now?
I suppose one thing it kind of ties in with one of your previous guests on here is, very early on in your career, everything's textbooks, everything's journals. It's research. This and that's cool because you have got to have that background and that foundation to actually have reasoning behind what you're doing. But then at the same time, over the years, you actually start to realise one of the biggest things that's impacting on your effectiveness as a coach is how you're working with the players that you are. And I know it's become quite a trendy topic in terms of that whole coach-athlete relationship and stuff like that. But it's a huge thing. You can have one coach with the greatest knowledge in the world, but if he hasn't got the ability to be able to tap in to that player's understanding and be able to get that player to buy into to the process, then all of that expertise, all of that knowledge can fall completely on its arse. So I think one of the biggest things that's given me going into where I am now is the really serious side of that personal relationship, providing that structure that person needs, but making them know that you're a huge part in being able to help them moving forwards. Because ultimately, people will want to work with you and be motivated to train with you if you can do something which will help them. Yeah. And if they believe that you're that type of person, regardless of whether they're a professional rugby player, amateur rugby player, or someone who doesn't even play sport, then they're really going to buy into the process, particularly if you can explain to them in a way that they understand of how what they're doing in the gym, for example, is going to relate to the end goal they want. Because I think one of the biggest challenges in S&C a lot of the time is people view the outcome as the training session. So get better at X exercise, where actually the exercises and the tools that you use are merely just vehicles to get the outcome that you want. So as a professional rugby player, that would be, to be able to score more points, to be able to make more metres when you go into contact, to have that effectiveness on the pitch. So I think that my background from the professional rugby side is naturally kind of transferred into what I'm doing now quite well, and being a huge benefit. Yeah, definitely.
I think you're right, and it's that balance of the art and science and figuring out what people actually want. Because we've all worked with people who love to squat, love to bench, they proper love their S&C, those athletes, and they're kind of easy. You've already sold them. But it's those other guys who kind of are more about the rugby, and it's explaining how improving these certain exercises or whatever it may be will actually carry over to rugby, and it's finding a way to actually explain it to them that they understand and they'll buy into. I think you're definitely right there.
I mean, it's we used to say a number of times that you're almost becoming more and more almost like a salesman in terms of when you're coaching, you're selling the training methods, the rationale behind it. You're selling it constantly to the players, so they invest into it. So they invest their effort into it to make sure that the outcome's actually achieved, and that's a real skill, and it's something I certainly don't claim to be a master at, but it's something which over the years I've started to pay more and more attention to, because actually a lot of the guys who had great engagement elsewhere in the sporting world as S&C coaches weren't necessarily the ones that had all the fancy technology. They weren't the ones that talked in signalling pathways and all these deeper, more scientific terms. They were the guys who just could engage and get people on board in terms of selling what they do, and then the players were naturally involved with it and can push forward from there.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. So conversely, looking back at your time in rugby, is there anything you do differently now?
In relation to the training or the coaching, or
in terms of training, or what we were just talking about in terms of dealing with coaches and players.
Um, yeah, I mean, I suppose there's quite a few things looking back in hindsight. I mean, going back to what we were just speaking about, I think an appreciation of that sooner on would have been helpful. But then again, you have got to have that kind of technical and more knowledge-based understanding to actually build the foundation for you to do those bits and pieces. So, that would certainly be one thing. I think probably another thing is again, when you're in the gym and when you're doing S&C, it's so easy to stay in that little S&C bubble. And, I've been there, I'll hold my hands up to that. And it's very easy to lose sight of the bigger picture of what you're trying to achieve. And when I speak to people, actually, the people who I feel are really bloody good at what they do are the ones that actually can explain it really simply. And it's because they get the big picture, and it's because they don't actually have to impress you as well. And the big picture being they can actually relate what they're doing in the gym at that time or what they get people doing to the very outcome that they want. So from my perspective, I suppose, over the years, like the coaches that I mentor now, I literally just take it to a 4-point process. The first point is, okay, based on the athlete that you're working with, what actually underpins performance? And I'm talking not in terms of strength and that at this stage. I'm talking about what do we know significantly puts points on the board, for example. So we know, first of all, we know key player availability. So having your best players available is fucking huge. You rely on those guys to be able to put the points on the board and get the results. So you've got to have your best players fit. In a rugby perspective, we know that your backs, in general speaking, very generally, their ability to be able to evade and make meters, again, was a key performance indicator. So there's another there. In terms of our forwards in general, you know that momentum, the ability to be able to make meters in contact as a byproduct of body mass and speed, was, again, a huge key performance indicator. So that's the first point. So then it was always working back from there. So, okay, what physical qualities underpin that? So what, like, physiological qualities and vice versa underpin that? Then what kind of training methods would underpin that? And then actually the very last bit, which is usually the one that completely can fall flat on its arse, is how do you practically apply that? With the logistics of what you've got, so the schedule, the equipment you've got available, the manpower you've got available, group sizes. How do you actually put all that together and actually make that an awesome session? Because you could take a session from a research journal and it'd be horrendous because it'd be monotonous, it'd be boring, it probably wouldn't work in large numbers. So again, going back to the Ashley Jones interview, that ability to be able to piece together all that bit up top that we spoke about into actually a training session that will engage players, but at the same time still tap into the very things that you're trying to improve. So I think that kind of holistic way of looking at things in relation to S&C and performance would probably be another big thing. And if I knew that, if I got my head around that sooner, it would have been, it would have made life a bit easier. But then you have to go through those other experiences, I suppose, to get to that point and that outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of kind of putting the whole thing together. You've got that scientific rationale of what actually matters, and then you work out how within your environment, with your players, your time constraints, whatever it might be, you actually work how that will actually fit in. And like you said, no matter what research you've got, it's got to fit your environment and who you're working with as well.
Oh, it's huge, and it's very easy, I think. And again, I'll hold my hands up to it as well. It's very easy when you're in your little club bubble or institute bubble to be quite cynical of what goes on outside of your realms. But going back to that model there, you could all be working towards the same bits. Obviously you're not, but you could be. But that bottom tier in terms of the logistics, because we all have different things available to us in terms of resources and whatnot, would mean actually the training sessions would look very different. That's not because that other person's doing a crap job. It's because actually they might not have 2 extra coaches. They might not have the equipment available. They might have to take a group of 25 guys at once. So it can be quite easy to be judgmental like that. But I think the beauty of being able to look at something really broadly and holistically, like looking at those 4 stages, is that regardless of who you speak to, whether it's other S&C coach, whether it's director of rugby, whether it's a rugby player who hasn't got a clue about S&C, you can talk about it in as much detail as is necessary, because ultimately you understand the very bare bones of what you're talking about. You understand the simple things. So if you need to talk about it in a bit more detail, cool, you can do that. But equally, if you just need to speak about it really simply, again, you've got the ability to be able to do that. So I think that's always a really key defining factor of somebody who really knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And going back to what you said just previously, I think it's difficult to go in like if you see one session from another coach, it's really difficult to kind of get, to kind of assess their whole, protocol or program, because it's one session in isolation, which is constrained by all those things we've discussed. You kind of need to see the whole picture and understand it. So I think, we shouldn't be kind of overcritical when you see, only a snapshot of what people are actually doing. I think you're right there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And particularly, there's even darker things that go on. Politics of coaching pressures and bits and pieces like that can play a huge impact in, again, what the S&C coach has available to him to be able to execute on certain sessions. So, yeah, over the years, I've become more and more empathetic, I suppose, to be able to actually think about, put yourself in their shoes. If they're getting heat from the DOR about certain bits and pieces, if they haven't got the greatest of manpower, and vice versa, it can often be very easy when you're in a more comfortable position to point the finger, when actually if you're in that position, you might actually struggle to do any better job than they could.
Yeah, definitely. So, Dave, you explained you've worked through all the different age groups at Leicester, which obviously gives you a great kind of perspective. And when working with a younger player, how do you approach things differently to like a seasoned pro?
Yeah, I think the kind of, I suppose, athletic development side of stuff, if you want to use any of the terms, I think it's a bit of a minefield. It's a real grey area, because by default, maturation and everything is a grey area. But I think it can be very easy, particularly from any type of training perspective, but S&C in this example, to not really have a clear direction with what you're doing, particularly, again, looking at the grand scheme of things. So, I mean, taking the project that started years ago at Leicester, we had the biggest problem of, we had a really big academy, but a large proportion of players would come in day one of pre-season to the academy, and they could lift weights, but they couldn't do it well. Technically they were poor, and we're talking at even basic exercises. And it took months and months and months for the coaches to be able to actually rectify those technical problems, because they'd spent years and years prior to that, obviously going through that early maturation process of putting in, you could call it movement patterns, I suppose, and ways of executing movement, which aren't particularly good for being able to effectively do S&C. So from our perspective, it was right, okay, if we're going to start working with these players 13, 14, 15 years of age, what's the actual purpose of it? Yes, we want to make them better rugby players, but where's the connection between the S&C you're doing on the pitch and making them a better rugby player? Because there's a huge grey area between those things and a huge amount of assumptions. So what we actually said is, look, our main priority is we want the guys to be able to lift more effectively when they come in, and to be able to move as rugby players more effectively when they come in. If you've got a front row player who has got no awareness of being able to move at his hips and keep his spine nicely neutral and locked in, that's going to have a huge impact on his ability to break down in relation to scrum posture and vice versa. So it transfers into so many things. So we wanted to be able to have the guys hit the ground running far quicker, so we wouldn't have lag time with their development. So actually they were developing as best as possible from day one, as opposed to actually having to wait months down the line while they're getting technically proficient at stuff, which they could have been doing far sooner. So we put together this program, which again logistically was difficult. We basically said to the rugby coaches, look, we're going to take 50% of your time with these players each week, and within a training session, we're going to do blocks of S&C, with obviously you doing blocks of rugby. And it actually ended up being a relatively easy sell, because the rugby coaches really bought into it, because they could see the benefits, and equally it meant that there were short, sharp blocks of work, like 10-minute blocks. So it kept things really nice and fresh with the players, because kids don't have the biggest attention span. Yeah. So with us, that process was all about, we're going to get them technically proficient at the lifts that they will be doing most likely when they come into the first year of the academy. And literally that was the main focus, because we knew if we did that, we knew that they'd be able to move better on the rugby pitch. We knew that they'd be able to get far more benefit sooner from their S&C training. And then as a byproduct, we knew that there would be more than likely a number of other additional benefits in terms of the development, in terms of injury, in terms of just general skill acquisition and vice versa, that they could benefit from. But they're the more grey areas. We wanted to make sure, first and foremost, we were influencing something that we knew we could definitely influence, and that was being able to speed up their ability to be able to perform more effective S&C. So with that little time span, that's how we looked at it. So we had a very clear thing we're going to improve, thing that we put into place to make sure we know it will improve it, and there hopefully will be additional benefits aside from that. But I think it's very easy when you're doing athletic development work and as an S&C coach with athletes to invest time in things which you're not actually sure of how beneficial they're going to be to work, particularly when you've got limited time with them as well. And then obviously from them, when you start as a full-time academy player, the context is changing, isn't it? You've got far more resources available. The time that you spend training is far more different. And again, that would differ between situations and clubs. But then they've got the physical foundations to be able to do proper resistance training more effectively and start to move them into a direction that's more advanced, I suppose, as they grow up and go towards a senior rugby player. But yeah, we knew by doing that we'd get them moving more effectively so we could hit the ground running. We know that injury-wise we'd be able to make them more physically robust to tolerate the demands of going into academy training, and then from there, be able to speed up their development, I suppose.
Yeah, you covered so many good points there. Obviously, and it's kind of what you're saying with those 4 points earlier. You have that sort of rationale of really knowing what you want to improve, and then you find the most efficient and effective way of doing it within your constraints. So it's there's some great points there. Sorry, Karen.
I was just going to say, actually, one of the interesting things that we did that is it's so hard to objectively monitor kind of how your S&C impacts on development, because naturally they'll physically develop even if you didn't do S&C with them. Yeah. But for us, we over years, because we had time with this, was able to say that within about 18 months of these kind of 1 training sessions per week with the combined with the rugby coaches, that we could get them proficient at the movements under load as well. So a lot of the time, I think we're going to a whole other realm here of movement screens, but if you're to be competent at an exercise under no load and be competent at an exercise under a degree of load are 2 very different separate skills. We know that if you're good at one doesn't necessarily mean that's going to have be able to transform into the other. So when we monitored players to actually see how well they were at getting to be able to execute these exercises that they'll do under a degree of load, we found out that pretty much it was about an 18-month period with this 1 time per week exposure that it took as a whole in general those group of players to be able to get to what we called like a Tiger standard, whereby they'd be in a position to be able to kind of hit the ground running with their training there. So again, that was a nice way for us to be able to kind of, as objective as you could do, see how things would improve. And we looked at other stuff like concentric vertical jump height and all sorts of bits and pieces. But again, you could do nothing with them and they'd still improve. So it's always difficult to be able to separate between what you do and obviously what Mother Nature does as well.
Yeah, definitely. So talking about those sort of things and getting into sort of monitoring and stuff, how have you used data and technology at Leicester in the past? And also, I mean, you touched on sort of research. Do you follow research, or is your coaching impacted a lot by the research, or do you kind of just use it as that background information?
Yeah, I mean, I was really fortunate to be, particularly the period I was there, to be involved with a setup which was well resourced, but not just that, had a very, very good direction. My my boss for that period, Alex Martin, who isn't one of the kind of household Twitter names of S&C, he in terms of putting a program together. And fitting into all the bits and pieces, I suppose, that we've been talking about, has been the best person I've literally ever come across at that. And an absolute kind of, I won't use the word genius because I know you'd be embarrassed, but it absolutely outstanding at that. And that meant that we had lots of different things going on, which were quite, I suppose you could say, exciting. Some which worked, some which didn't work at all, but that's part of learning. And we did, we did adopt GPS early on. We did adopt, research in-house into analytics and looking at what actually underpins performance. And we did get a lot out of that. But equally, we also realised that we also didn't get a lot out of certain bits of it as well. it'll be interesting to see over the years, I think, in professional sport, how particularly things like analytics get used, because I think at the moment they're very attractive, they're very new, but as people start to find out more about them, actually, how people's opinions will change, because there's certainly big ways which I think technology can support, what we do as strength and conditioning coaches, but I do think in balance it can be over pushed a little bit. I think the the sexy side of having great technology, fancy data, can sometimes overshadow actually the real key qualities that are actually the ability of somebody to be able to coach. So for me, for example, technology was brilliant from a GPS perspective at figuring out what a player's normal training week would be, an individual player's training week. So when they got injured, I had a clear snapshot of where I needed to get them back to.
Yeah.
So because I knew what performance was in terms of match day, but also training, again, it then meant I could reverse engineer backwards. Okay, these are the steps that we need to go through. This is the journey we need to be able to create to get them back up to that point. Because I think it's very easy, particularly when you're working with injuries, to kind of be working towards very vague things. Whereas if you know, right, I'm working towards, on the heaviest training in the day, they're doing this much volume, they're doing this much at this intensity, they're doing this many change of directions at this intensity, it means that you can very, very precisely reintegrate that player back up to that point as well. So GPS, for example, was a great way of being able to do that. And I think the analytics side, being able to actually pinpoint what underpins performance. So obviously when we first started speaking, I knew there were certain key criteria that we could impact on as S&C coaches, because there's lots of performance things that we can't influence as S&C coaches, but there are some really key bits that we can do. So by actually knowing what those things are, which might not necessarily be the same depending on the club you're at and vice versa, by knowing those exact things, it meant we had real laser focus on actually what our training was trying to improve as well. So again, I think that was another key thing. But just in my opinion, I do think that at this moment in time, the technology side of sports science and that can sometimes overshadow the most important thing, which is actually the coach's ability. We used to say you could have a database which would tell you how fresh a player is, how well they've slept, where they're sore. But you know what? The best measure of that is actually the coach just asking that player themselves, because you'll get much more information out of them rather than just a number. And a lot of the time with those type of systems, it's all retrospective. It's not actually real time, so you can't actually make informed decisions in the moment. So yeah, even though I think there are certain things that can be a benefit as discussed, it will be interesting to see how technology, I think, impacts professional sport, because I think there's a lot of things that are being talked about and a lot of big claims being made, which actually, in reality, I don't think there's a great deal of evidence to support them.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because, all the clubs are under so much pressure, to be successful. And there's, all these different bits of technology coming out and everyone wants to get the next big thing. But you kind of want to avoid, any fads. But then, like you said, you've got to try some things to realise, they are no good or whether there is value to them.
No, 100%. But I think, like the example I gave with the, monitoring certain bits and pieces when actually, you could just as a coach, you can actually ask the player. I think on the outside, sometimes things can look quite attractive, but actually when you see them running in the day-to-day world of your environment, your club, your organisation, you actually start to realise that actually, in practice, they don't quite work the way that you expected, which is obviously a huge thing because, time pressures, everyone wants a piece of the players and bits and pieces means that, we don't have ages to be able to have players doing this, doing that and vice versa. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. Now, this is a question we ask all our guests. Dead simple is, what do you think is the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning?
Where do we begin? Look, I mean, it's easy to be, I suppose, judgmental as an S&C coach because it's your trade, isn't it? You've got to know what you're doing. But I think, if I think back, particularly when I was younger and I didn't have a clue what I was doing, obviously you're just following any information you've got, what your mate does, and there's so much information out on the internet now, literally, it's overwhelming. But I think one of the things that I observe, particularly, I mean, probably again thinking about some of your listeners and bits and pieces who don't have, a professional club that they're associating themselves to and all that support. I think one of the biggest problems is when you're in the weight room doing too much in terms of exercises. So one of the biggest surprises that players and people who we work with now have when they first come to us is actually there isn't a shitload of exercises. And the reason is because we know exactly what they need to do to become better at what they want and the specific things which are going to lead there and the constraints of how their body moves and injuries and bits and pieces. I could choose 8 different exercises, but why don't I just pick four exercises, for example, which are going to address those key things in the best way possible and put all my eggs into those baskets? Because, if I think back when I used to train, because you're not entirely sure how a certain exercise or training method can improve the thing that you want. Say, for example, you want to get quicker, so you've got to get stronger and more powerful. There's 100 million different things you could do. So usually people think, shit, I better do this, and this, hoping that a little bit of what they throw at the wall will actually stick. Where actually one of the best things you can do is, instead of hoping part of it will stick, you want to make sure that every single rep of every single set is the very best thing to take you forwards towards your goal. So I think players and people involved in sport who want to benefit from their S&C shouldn't feel the need that they have to do lots and lots and lots of stuff. It's what we used to call the kitchen sink approach. Just throw everything in there. It's far better to be far more informed of what you're doing, decide on what that is, and then put everything into that basket. So just as a little bit of an example, it can differ even between people who have the same goals. So you might have two, you might have 2 scrum halves, for example. Obviously, acceleration is a huge factor. However, one might have a great back squat. So a back squat is a movement which we know the limiting factor will be their ability to generate force, not their ability to execute the movement. Whereas the other one, actually, his technique on it, because lumbar problems, because of ankle mobility issues, his squat might be pretty crap. So instead of just having him squat and trying to be able to do that, we'd actually then look, okay, then what other lower limb exercise could he do, which will still lead to the same outcomes that we want, but will still allow him to develop and improve in the best way possible, and then putting all the eggs into the basket of that, rather than feeling the need, right, okay, I better do a bit of back squatting, but because I'm not so great at that, I'm going to do some deadlifting, then I'm going to do some lunging, and feeling there's that big need. So I think my advice always to players is, think about what you need to develop. Know what it is that you've got to be able to improve, and the training tools you can use, and do the stuff that you're bloody good at, that you can really execute on, where force is the limiting factor, not technique, and hedge your bets on that, and you'll be shocked at how much quicker you improve, as opposed to just trying to do a load of stuff just because you think the professionals do it.
Yeah, definitely. I think you could show an athlete, or even myself. I looked at a program and there was 10 exercises. I'd straight away pick which ones I was going to put most of my effort into, because you can't just you've only got enough energy for a certain amount of to adapt, so to speak. So just pick the ones you're going to get the most bang for your buck for, and put all that energy into that.
Well, you hit a great point there as well. If you're a player, if you're a player of any standard, if you're going to the gym and you look at your sheet and it's got a shitload of stuff on there, instantly you're thinking, crikey, I'm pushed for time. Typically then what happens is you're not using the rest periods that you should be. You're probably going to get a little bit lazy with your technique. And again, you're not actually going to be motivated to do the session as much, because you're going to feel that you're playing catch up because you've got so much to get through. However, if you've got a few things on there, which you know you can really grip and rip into, you can definitely do within the time frame, you can use the right rest periods to get the very best out of that exercise, get the intensity required, all of a sudden that's a big thing. And that's actually one of the things that during my last season, I had a player come to me from another club, and that's the exact point that he made about being able to focus on doing less but really good. Was when he turned up, he wasn't in that initial panic of, oh shit, I've got to use all this equipment, I might have to queue for this, queue for that. He thought, right, I've got this to do, this to do, this to do, this to do, let's go down and actually get it done. So you're right, I think it has a big impact on that type of your motivation towards the session as well.
Yeah, and also I think it's like with British cycling's, they advertise so much their marginal gains. So people are always looking to get those, 1 or 2%, when they're not taking care of the big, 95% of, big compound lifts, increasing force development and things like that.
I couldn't agree more, and it's and that's a big impact with nutrition as well, and usually people use that as an excuse, they're worrying about the micro when they're completely overlooking the macro, and you have to get them to step back for a moment and think, shit, look, you're talking about this being a problem. Crikey, you're not even doing this. So the example you're talking about there is, someone can do all the speed work they want in the world, but if they haven't been strength training for the best part of 4 or 6 weeks, that's going to have a huge impact on their ability to generate force, power, RFD, and consequently, they're not going to get the outcome that they want. And I suppose that's a big part of being an S&C coach as well. It's being able to manage those expectations, because it is sexy to go after the micro, isn't it? All those bits and pieces. But it's quite interesting as well when you hear about marginal gains of bits and pieces. The press's reporting on that and the actual reality of what that was. I think from what I'm aware, two very different things as well. I think as well with your athletes as well, if you're always pushing the micro and forgetting the macro, it almost creates a culture as well of avoiding the hard work sometimes, because I think that the macro stuff can be the more challenging stuff. It's your big lifts and everything like that. Sometimes the more monotonous stuff. But just because it's not sexy and it can be a bit monotonous doesn't actually mean that it's one of the most important things. And I think sometimes players like the sexy stuff because it can allow them to get away from the stuff which is actually more important, but usually requires a tad more effort.
Yeah, definitely, totally agree. So, looking to the future, how do you see things sort of changing in strength and conditioning in terms of rugby? You mentioned this question to me. I actually had to think about it because I wasn't really too sure. I think the first thing was what we talked about in terms of how technology will be impacting on strength and conditioning. Whether at the moment it's kind of in a little bit of a honeymoon period, and actually what people will start to conclude when they actually start to get some real kind of long-term data and analysis out of that, of actually what's impacting what, because it is a big investment for clubs. But I think the other thing is, I think more and more, because players are coming through systems where at a younger age they're getting better educated at S&C. So, every academy now has S&C staff, even players who aren't coming from academies have got S&C support. You've got S&C available on the internet and everything like that. And it almost means now that everybody's becoming a bit of an expert. And I think one of the things that I was starting to observe as I was finishing off in Premiership rugby was there was definitely players being a lot more aware and self-conscious of their opinion on S&C. And I think that's going to be something that gets more and more compounded over the years as players become more and more educated and upskilled on it. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge for the S&C coach because, ultimately you're employed to be an expert in that role. And yes, you've got to listen to your players and everything like that. But if you can't manage expectations and if you can't still provide the structure that's there, you're making yourself almost obsolete. And I think that'll be one of the biggest challenges as players become more knowledgeable. It'll be more challenging for S&C coaches to be able to get buy into the program, I suppose, because people are going to have far more opinions. So I think that's a really big one. Yeah, that's interesting because, like say, everyone kind of has an opinion, and it almost touches on what we're talking about, the kind of marginal gains thing. Is that everyone has an opinion on how you can slightly prescribe things differently, but so long as those the most important things are in place, you can have that kind of variety. But it's an interesting one, kind of almost keeping everyone happy, but making sure sure you're covering those bases.
It's a huge challenge. It's it's one it's one that's very difficult to see from the outside world. But yeah, you have to have a structure. You have to have a system in place. Just because you have structure, providing structure as a coach is very different to being controlling as a coach. People usually see the two run in tandem. They're very separate things. Control is do it my way. This is the only way. I'm not going to listen to you. Structure is about providing all the bits and pieces with rationale as to why you're doing it, why it's best practice. But there's a degree of movement within that structure. But there will become a point where you can step outside that structure, and that's the challenge I think of the S&C coach is, if you've just got a player doing their own session, you then become obsolete. So it's about making sure you do have structure, you do listen to people, you do have that flexibility to be able to still achieve what you need to, but to be like malleable to fit the individual, but also have that point where there is a structure. A structure does have limits to it, and if you step outside those limits, well, that's not actually buying into the program, and that will become more and more challenge, I think, as players become greater and greater experts in what they do. But I always used to say, to players as well, it's all down to trust, isn't it? And if a player said to me, if my expertise is strength and conditioning, my expertise wasn't, for example, to be able to box kick a ball or to be able to throw a ball in a line out. If one of my players was coaching me to be a better line out thrower as an S&C coach, or a better box kicker as an S&C coach, I'd listen to everything they'd say, because even though I'd have my opinions because I know about the body, I'd trust their judgment because they're an expert in that. And I think that's the line that players have to be able to see as well. That they do have awareness of their body. You've got to listen to them, particularly as they become more and more experienced and more understanding in S&C. But at the same time, there still needs to be that trust and mutual respect that you will listen to them, you take everything on board, but equally you're employed and you're there to support them and to put your expertise into best practice, and therefore there does have to be that structure there ultimately.
Yeah, and it also it does go back to the Ashley Jones conversation where he said you've kind of got the four quadrants where obviously the younger athletes, this is what you're doing, there's no discussion, and as you go through there's more and more discussion until it's almost they're that experienced that you can give them your advice and through your expertise, but ultimately they have a lot more say in it. So that's very good points there. I feel like we could talk all day, Dave. Some really good information for the listeners, and I'm sure they get a huge amount out of it. But lastly, where can people learn some more about yourself?
Obviously got our website, www.coalitionperformance.co.uk. We're pretty active on social media. Co-Performance is our Twitter account and the Facebook account. Going to probably delve into the world of Snapchat soon for my own perils. But I do a lot of blogging and posting on the site and social media, particularly targeted at kind of not your professional level kind of athletes, but your kind of weekend warriors, your amateur rugby players and bits and pieces like that, to be able to provide support there. So people can get in touch and give us a shout in multiple ways, whatever they deem necessary.
Brilliant, Dave. Thanks very much. All the best with Coalition Performance, and just thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to episode 4 of the Rugby Renegade Podcast. We'd also like to thank Dave Cripps for taking the time to speak to us, and I'm sure you learned a lot from him. So what to do next? Check us out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever's your bag. And please subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, again, whichever one you use, and give us a good review. And of course, subscribe, and there's more coming, so stay tuned.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.